for this episode of Q&A, I thought I would go through a lot of the questions that are relating to a little bit of a rebrand that I am going through. I've announced this on Instagram and how I'm going to be focusing on a few different concepts and bringing in some teachings and education around quantum health and circadian rhythm, circadian health, in hopes to help people heal even further. We've done a really deep dive into blood sugar issues and insulin resistance, and I have struggled with my own blood sugar and cortisol issues. So I've been learning a lot about circadian health and quantum health, quantum biology. And if you have no idea what that is, that's okay. Because I didn't either. I'd look at that word, I'd be like, what the heck is quantum? Like, I don't even know what that means. I had a lot of biology and chemistry as an undergrad. So the first question, really, I'll dive into this. So this was from a follower on my Instagram who also watched my master class. And this was from Pam. And she said, I've heard you talk about cortisol and blood sugar issues, your own struggles with cortisol and blood sugar issues on Instagram. How are you going about treating this? Okay, so I just want to back up and say I've struggled with cortisol issues for a long time, and I never really knew why it was such a struggle for me. I just figured it was because I was stressed and I'm a type A personality. I have so much going on. I'm all about, I'm really trying to change this, but I'm all about, getting my checklist done and getting things crossed off my list and making sure that, my day-to-day is, accomplished. And, I'm always working on something. And I've posted about this recently, like I have a really hard time just sitting and being, and something that I definitely need to work on. I'm not even actually exploring like why I am this way. And some of it I know is just I have a driven personality. My brain never shuts off. I have all these ideas popping into my head, especially with this quantum health and circadian health. I'm like, oh my gosh, I could build a course about this, and I could teach about this. And oh, it's such a missing piece that I really want everyone to know about. And now my brain just spins again. And it's a good thing. I definitely don't want to compare myself to Elon Musk, but I've watched a few interviews with him and I've read a few articles about him and how he feels the same way. Like he just can never shut down his brain. Like he just is, even when he's just appears to be sitting there, he's thinking about something. And that's kind of how I am. I don't say that it's always a good thing, because it can get a person into trouble, but I always thought that was mainly where my cortisol issues were stemming from. And the last time I wore a blood sugar, continuous glucose meter, a continuous glucose monitor was about 7 months ago. It was like last summer. And I hadn't wanted to wear one since then because of everything that I went through with my mom. Last summer, when I was wearing a glucose meter, I noticed that my baseline blood sugars, my morning blood sugars, and even my baseline during the day was higher than what it had been when I had last worn a continuous glucose monitor. Prior to that, like my blood sugars were in the 70s and 80s. I would really spike over 140, even with a fair amount of carbohydrates, healthy carbohydrates. But I was seeing some really great blood sugar readings. And when I got my last labs done, I think my fasting glucose was like 66 or 70, somewhere in that arena. And when I put a glucose monitor on last summer, I was like, what the heck is going on? Like this, there's no way I'm in the 90s. And I thought it was a calibration issue. I'm like, well, maybe it's the actual monitor. But then I wore another one, like I wore one for a whole month so I could do some more experimentation. And the same thing, they were a little bit lower, but because then I thought, oh, maybe it's my menstrual cycle. Maybe it's because my blood sugars are a little bit higher during the latter stages of my menstrual cycle. And I just didn't want to come to terms that my morning blood sugars were creeping up. I could not figure it out. Like it just didn't make any sense to me. So then my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer that had already metastasized to her liver and her spine last July. So I knew, I mean, I know enough about cancer. I'm no cancer expert, but I know enough about cancer and pancreatic cancer that was a terrible diagnosis to receive and that she didn't have long, even if we could find some alternatives. That's a whole nother podcast. But anyway, I then was taking her to chemo appointments, even though I didn't want her to do chemo. She wanted to try it. I was taking her to appointments. I was trying to get her literature on alternatives that were basically non-existent for us, and completely dismissed by her oncologist. And watching her deteriorate after every single chemo treatment. And then basically after Christmas, she just was in such a bad state. I admitted her, I did the hospice paper to admit her into hospice on January 23rd. And I watched her die slowly for a month. And she died on February 23rd, a day before her birthday. But all of this to say, when I didn't want to wear a glucose meter during that time because I figured I'm in such a high stress zone that I know my blood sugars are not going to be good, or I kind of suspected they wouldn't have gotten any better. And so I was contacted by a company called Good Idea. You might be familiar with their drinks. It's basically like a carbonated water that has some things added to it that helps mitigate blood sugar spikes. But they asked me if I would do some experiments for them and wear a glucose monitor again. And I wanted to, but I was kind of hesitant. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm kind of afraid of what I'm going to find. So anyway, I put the glucose meter on a few days ago and my morning blood sugars are even worse. Like they're in the 90s. One of the mornings before I had eaten anything, and I hadn't eaten since 4:30 the day before, it went up to 120 before I ate anything. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is in type 2 diabetic range. This is insane. But yet my hemoglobin A1C is normal. And as I would go throughout my day and eat, I would see my blood sugars come back down at least into the 90s as baseline. And I didn't see a lot of peaks. Like it's not like I would eat what I normally eat and I'd see this huge spike. Like that was not happening. It was the overnight and morning blood sugars. That is not even so much overnight, but that dawn phenomenon that I've talked about, the dawn effect. I was having major issues with it. I'm like, what the heck? I have, this is all I talk about. I'm like the insulin resistance girl, and I help people to, overcome this. And here I am dealing with blood sugars in the pre-diabetic and even in the diabetic phase. And I was just like, what is going on? And a couple of months ago, I mean, I had learned about some circadian fasting and, a little bit about quantum health over the last, several months ago, but I am really deep diving into it now. And I started posting about this on Instagram because I think it's so, so important. And I think I finally found the missing link for me and why my cortisol is basically atrocious. So I had some cortisol testing done about a year ago. It was a year ago this summer, I think. I can't remember if it's a year or 2 years, but I think it was last summer. And it was a saliva test. And I basically spit into these test tubes about 5 or 6 times a day because your cortisol fluctuates, right? It's supposed to come up in the morning, reach its peak, and then start to decline and lower at night. That's when melatonin will start to increase. They're kind of counter hormones to each other. And as melatonin increases, cortisol decreases. You do not want your cortisol high at night because then you can't sleep, you're restless, you don't get good deep sleep, your melatonin is thrown off. So anyway, I started to dive into this because I'm like, I have no idea why my cortisol, like, yes, I've been stressed. Yes, I've definitely been stressed, but I'm the metabolic health lady. Like I'm doing everything I can other than trying to mitigate my stress further. And so I started learning more about our light environment and our circadian environments and EMF exposure. And like I said, I had learned some about this, especially the EMF exposure, but I I didn't really know a ton about the sunlight and the light environment and how morning sunlight stimulates your cortisol and sets your cortisol levels up for the entire day. And going outside throughout the day is super important to tell your body what time it is and to tell cortisol, when to peak and when to start to decline, to tell melatonin when to start taking over. And this is just messed up for me. Like my circadian rhythm. Like, yes, I wake up early. I have good energy. I'm not gonna say I don't. Like for 48 years old, I feel like I say my age and I'm like, oh my gosh, really? I don't feel 48, which I'm very happy about. I wake up with a good amount of energy. I exercise every morning, pretty much like either walking or weight training, but I wasn't getting that morning sunlight exposure like I thought I was. So I would be out every morning, but a lot of times I'm going to the gym at 5:30 a.m. and getting this crappy, horrible fluorescent lighting into my eyes, the first light exposure. Or when I don't use sunglasses anymore, but for years and years, even when I was doing my morning runs and I'd be out a lot with sunrise, and I still am, I like to walk my dogs at sunrise. A lot of times I was wearing sunglasses and I was blocking that whole cortisol response. So now I'm like really starting to move deeper into the circadian and the quantum parts of the cortisol response, because morning sunlight into the backs of your eyes, like I said, it stimulates that morning cortisol increase, and it sets the tone for the cortisol and the melatonin and even leptin throughout the course of the day, and even insulin. So I don't want to claim to be an expert on this yet. I am doing a deep dive into this and learning all that I can, because it's such a problem for me personally, and I know it's a problem for so many of you. I cannot tell you how many students I have who are like, I have decent blood sugar during the day, but my morning blood sugars, I cannot get them down. No matter what I do, I have like borderline to high blood sugars in the morning. Can you help? And my response was always, okay, well, let's do more circadian fasting. Let's move your window earlier in the day, which is very, very helpful. Don't get me wrong. And I've done that myself. Like, let's start eating earlier in the day, cut off your eating window earlier in the evening. Let's try to mitigate your stress response as much as possible. Let's try to bring inflammation down in your body. We'll do some, food sensitivity testing if you think you need it to bring inflammation down even further. But I was completely missing this whole piece of the puzzle with sun exposure and light exposure and artificial lighting, and how detrimental it is on our hormonal network. So I'm learning more and more about that. So that's how I am currently treating my cortisol issues, is to get out into the sunlight every single morning, even if there's no sun, even if it's raining, snowing. I mean, we're finally past the snow here in Wisconsin here in April, but I'm out there no matter what. If it's raining, if it's snowing, if it's cloudy, if it's sunny, I'm out there for at least a couple of minutes. When I drive my son to school, I pretty much take him to school every morning. He'll be 16 this summer, but I'm still driving him to school, and I actually really love that time. But I put my window down and he's like, Mom, really? The circadian, now we got the circadian stuff going. I'm like, yep, just bear with me. We're going to ride to school with our window open. So at least I try to get out for a while. Like I usually walk my dogs if I'm not at strength training, but I at least do that much. And then I roll my window down when I take him to school. And then I have the luxury of working at home. So I can, if I'm not meeting with people or doing a podcast recording, I go outside and I eat outside. I've been eating outside. I've been eating my meals outside. I've been eating earlier. I've been starting to experiment with that. And one of the other things that really helps with your cortisol is eating within an hour of sunrise. And this is hard for me. And it's hard for me to sit here and tell you about this, because I've been telling people for years to keep moving your eating window back slowly, slowly, slowly. And those people with cortisol and adrenal issues, this can make things worse. And I've seen that with me. So it's interesting because I've reversed my insulin resistance. I have, and I'm super thankful for that. And I'm so glad that I learned all about how to do that. And I have experienced food freedom in the process. Like, I don't think about food, but I got to get this cortisol and these morning blood sugars under wraps. So my body's kind of in this, stressed response when I wake up in the morning right now. So I'm starting to move, slowly eat earlier and earlier, which is really hard for me. I don't actually like to eat early in the morning anymore, even though I'm an early morning person. I've been waiting till like 10 or 11, but I'm trying to get a good bolus of protein of 20 to 30 grams or so within an hour of sunrise, and then be done eating about 4 o'clock. And I know that that seems kind of crazy for a lot of you, and it might not be feasible. Right now, it's feasible for me because 2 of my kids are at college, and my youngest, who is at home with me yet, is in golf right now. So he doesn't get home till 5:30, 6 o'clock. And a lot of times my husband's not, depending on his work schedule. So I just eat early, and, my husband's work schedule, I never know if he's going to be eating dinner with us or not. So I just make something for my son when he comes home, and I sit with him and have dinner with him. I don't eat my dinner at that time, but I sit with him while he eats his dinner. And then the other thing that I'm being super careful about is mitigating blue light exposure in the evening, because that blue light exposure basically is like midday sunlight. So if you go outside and your brain perceives all this blue light that you're seeing in your environment in the daytime, which is good. You want that. You want the blue light, everything that is natural in our environment is just perfect and so good. And God made it that way. But we have manipulated our environment so much. So to go outside during the day, get the blue light exposure is fabulous. But then when the sun sets, you're getting the red light more again, right? And then once it's dark, you're not supposed to have access to blue light anymore. Okay, so the light bulb has only been around for 100 years or so. And now we have all this blue light exposure after dark that is not natural to humans. So we have phones we're looking at, we have TV screens we're looking at, we have computer screens we're looking at, we have LED light bulbs, which I hate. We have fluorescent light bulbs. You can't even get incandescent light bulbs in California. How crazy is that? And so we're exposed to all this blue light. And so this comes into our eyes, and our eyes are like, oh, it's midday. Like, your brain doesn't know it's 9:23 p.m. Your brain says, holy crap, blue light, wake up, produce cortisol. And so then you get this cortisol surge at night, and you cannot fall asleep. You cannot stay asleep. You have high blood sugars overnight. You have high blood sugars in the morning, and a huge cortisol response. And this is what's happening to me. I'm not a big person. I don't go on my phone a lot at night. I really have tried to mitigate that, but it's hard to get away from. So I have blue locking glasses that I use at night. My kids laughed their butts off at me when I first got them because they're really pretty orange, and you kind of look like a space creature or something when you put them on. But I'm like, I don't give a rat's butt anymore because I have cortisol issues. I want to sleep. I'm perimenopausal. I'm moving into menopause years, and I want to be able to, feel my best and get rid of, bring my cortisol back into balance. And the longer your cortisol issues have been there, mine probably started in my 20s. I would think when I had my children, I had 3 kids within 5 years. I breastfed them all. So I was either pregnant or breastfeeding for about 7 years, chronically sleep deprived, up at night. I'm sure my circadian rhythms and my inflammation, like everything was destroyed during that time. And yes, I spent a lot of time outside. I'll talk more about this. I'm still on question number 1. I'll talk about this more in future episodes, but I have innately always loved the sun. I can't tell you how many sideways glances I have gotten from people when I don't slather sunscreen on myself and my kids. When my kids were little, even before I knew any of this stuff, I'm like, how can slathering all this toxic sunscreen be good for my children? They need sun. Like, I'm going to wait at least an hour before I put sunscreen on them. So I did put sunscreen on them, like if we were out in the boat or we were at the beach all day. But my kids always had a nice suntan every summer. And of course, like I have darker skin and my kids have probably more melanin than a lot of white people, but my youngest especially, he gets so tan. I mean, people be like, gosh, Sam is as brown as a berry and it's only June. I'm like, yeah, well, that's because he gets sun exposure and I don't cover him up every second because the sun is naturally good for us. Now, please hear me. I'm not saying go and get a sunburn. That's not healthy. I'm not saying go burn your skin. What I am saying is the sun is very, very healing to us. And we've been taught to hide from it, to get inside, to put shirts on, to slather on sunscreen before you even go outside because you don't want to burn. And this is just such horrible, horrible advice. Again, I am not advocating sunburns, but I am advocating safe sun exposure, building a solar callus. I'll bring guest experts on to explain more of this, but I've always known inherently that the sun was good for me in the right dosages. And to being outside, I've learned a lot about grounding. So anyway, I feel like, so I've been teaching you all about blood sugar issues, about reversing insulin resistance, about nutrition. I am still very in favor of all of these things, but I think we need to tweak it a little bit for a lot of people, especially if there's cortisol issues coming into play and we need to bring the whole light environment piece in. So as of now, what I'm doing to try to reverse my cortisol issues and bring those back into balance and get my morning blood sugars back under wraps, I'm going out to see the sunrise as much as I can every morning for at least a few minutes without glasses. I don't wear glasses or contacts, but if you can go out without glasses or contacts, sorry about that. I didn't think that those came through while I was recording. But if you can go out with glasses or contacts, that is helpful. And then, if you can go out for a couple minutes midday, just again, to let your brain say, oh, okay, it's still, afternoon, all this blue light is here. And then after the sun sets, putting some blue light blocking glasses on. I use glasses from RA Optics, it's called. And I also have, I'm blanking on the name. It'll come to Bone Charge. Bond Charge makes exceptional glasses that I have a discount link to. I think I have 15% off all of they have daytime computer glasses. They have daytime sensitivity glasses, and they have nighttime infrared blue light blocking glasses. So I'll put the link down there. I have a pair from RA Optics because I got those sent to me with something that had to do with my Aura ring a couple of years ago. So that's another fantastic company. I don't have an affiliate code for that company though. But anyway, getting the blue light mitigated as much as possible and settling into a bedtime routine. I'll keep you posted on my morning blood sugars though, because they are not in a good place right now. And again, I just came off one of the most stressful seasons of my entire life. Even after my mom passed, of course, that's hard. I miss her. But planning her memorial was really tough too. I have two sisters, bless them, my older sister especially, but my older sister has severe ADHD. And my dad is not the take charge kind of guy. So I'm the one in my family who takes care of everything. So I planned all her memorial service pretty much. Her sisters did help me a little bit with that as well, which I am very, very thankful for. But most of it fell on my shoulders, and still taking care of my dad and going through everything. Still in a stressful season, but hopefully I can start to get those mitigated. So okay, that's that's just question one. Let's move on. So question two won't be as long, I promise. So question two came from Kaylee from my webinar. And it said, what about a waist circumference for a woman who is 5'11". I find it hard to believe a waist circumference of greater than 35 inches, or sorry, less than 35 inches is reasonable. So I want to put this in context for you. So one of the when we look at waist circumference, if your waist circumference is more than 35 inches for a female or more than 40 inches for a male, those two things in and of themselves can be risk factors for metabolic disease. Now I totally get that we're all built a little bit differently, right? Like I think, at least for myself, I have like wider shoulders for a woman. My dad has really wide shoulders. His dad was a swimmer and diver. My rib cage, I think, is bigger than a lot of women, even though I'm not saying like I'm thin, yes, but I have like a more athletic build than, it's not like I have a slight build by any means, but I totally get what you're saying here. Like, oh, it seems like, a waist circumference less than 35 doesn't seem applicable. Height doesn't really matter here. Like, yeah, I get that as 5'11", you could be really, really thin, you could be really, really husky, but when we're looking at waist circumference, and again, this is not the only risk factor, but under 35 for women and under 40 for a male is where we like to see, because of course, when we are depositing more central fat and fat around our organs, that is way more detrimental and a risk factor for metabolic disease, because then of course we're packing on fat around the organs, we're developing fatty liver, our pancreas isn't working as well. We don't want to pack fat around the organs. I mean, we don't want to pack extra fat at all, that beyond what we need as a healthy range, but around the organs is especially detrimental. And that's why we look at waist circumference. So height doesn't really come into play here. It's more just of a male versus female thing. So yeah, I mean, this takes into consideration, even if you tend to be, a huskier woman or man, you still don't want your waist circumference to be past a certain point. And that's at the smallest part of your waist, getting a measurement and seeing if you're female less than 35, male less than 40. And of course, it's not the only risk factor, but it does play a role, because you don't want that central obesity to develop, and then your organs aren't working as well. You're developing higher blood sugars, all of that stuff. So, and that just kind of brings me back to my own blood sugars. My visceral fat, I have a Fit Track scale that tracks visceral fat. It tracks all these cool things. We'll put a link for it in the show notes as well. I think I have a 15% off code for that. It's called Fit Track, but it also it does your muscle mass, your bone density, your lean tissue versus your fat mass, but it also tracks visceral fat, which is really cool. And I know my visceral fat is really low. So anyway, and my waist circumference is low too, but that in and of itself can be a risk factor. Okay, number 3 is from Katrine. She said, I've heard it's important to be careful with fasting during the luteal phase. Is this something you take into consideration with fasting? Yes. And I've talked about this many times on the podcast, and I think I've done a hot topic on this. I have a whole lesson about this inside my Low Insulin Academy course, because there are nuances for women. And now that I'm going through some more major, hormone and blood sugar issues myself, you do want to be careful here. And so the luteal phase occurs from the time where you ovulate until you get your period. So it's kind of that second phase of, or the second half, I should say, second half of your menstrual cycle. And this is when progesterone tends to be higher, and it's harder to fast during that phase. You tend to be more hungry. You tend to crave sugar and carbohydrates, because you're actually burning a few more calories in anticipation of, having to possibly feed a baby. And so until you get your period again, it's more difficult to fast. And again, I'm not proud to say this, but I didn't really change my fasting regimen all that much for my menstrual cycle, because it didn't really, I didn't feel hungrier. I didn't have more cravings in my luteal phase than my follicular phase, which is the first half of your cycle. But I probably should have paid more attention to this. So I have backed off a bit on my fasting. And like I said, I'm experimenting with eating within an hour of sunrise, which is very foreign to me. I haven't done this in 5 years. Getting a good bolus of protein in, and a little bit of fat, not carbohydrates, because I don't want to stimulate, a higher blood sugar response, but leveling out that blood sugar early within, an hour of sunrise. Um, and then I will be more appropriate in my luteal phase. But I find that fasting through dinner works very well for me, or eating a really early dinner. I like to eat around 4 and then fast till morning, and that tends to work really well for me. But there's definitely some nuances, like if you have more of a metabolic, issue, like you have some major metabolic issues that you're working through, so you might be doing some more advanced fasting protocols. I do suggest not doing any sort of like longer fasts about 3 to 5 days prior to your menstrual cycle, and even backing off altogether in that luteal phase to do more, maybe 16 to 18 hours of fasting most days, and then right before the menstrual cycle, maybe cutting that back even to more like 14 to 16 hours of fasting, or even 12 to 14 hours of fasting, and just being a little bit gentler on the body. So I do teach that, and there's a whole like I said, there's a lesson about this inside my course, and I know I've done past podcasts on this topic as well, because you want to work with your hormones and not against them. Okay, last question. I have type 2 diabetes and I'm on medications. Will your Low Insulin Academy program work for me at this point? Absolutely. I feel like that's one of the biggest crimes in our health industry, is telling somebody that they will have prediabetes and type 2 diabetes forever, and it's going to progress, and once you're on medication and insulin, you'll never come off of that. That is such bull crap. It drives me crazy. But this is how doctors are taught. They're taught to diagnose and treat with pharmaceutical. The pharmaceuticals aren't working, you give more pharmaceuticals until you get to the point of needing exogenous insulin. And this is because of insulin resistance. Your cells are not utilizing insulin well when you have type 2 diabetes. Too much blood sugar is hanging out in the bloodstream because it's not getting into the cell. So you have to reverse the insulin resistance in order to reverse the disease process. And so it takes time and patience, and it takes sometimes some more aggressive strategies and therapies, but you can definitely reverse the issues in the vast majority of cases. Now, if you're on a lot of medications or insulin, you might not ever completely come off your medications. You might need one medication or some supplements. Maybe not, I've had plenty of students who have reversed it completely, but you could at least like maybe get off your insulin, get off some of your medications, and at least mitigate the need for pharmaceuticals and improve your health little by little. But the longer you've had type 2 diabetes, the more aggressive you might need to be to reverse it. And, if you're on a lot of insulin, it usually takes a while to get that disease process back under wraps, and blood sugars into a healthy response again. But it can be done. Like, the body's meant to heal. Your body is not meant to be sick. Your body is meant to thrive and heal. We are so far removed from what is normal for humans as far as our food systems go, as far as our environment goes, like our light environment that I was talking about. We're inside all day. We're under artificial lighting. We're eating crappy, terrible food that isn't really food. We're eating all the dang time because we have so much food at our exposure. We're eating food that's been highly processed, that is not meant to go into the human body. We're exposed to all of these toxins. I don't want to like make this like doomsday, but it's crazy how much the human body can actually take and not completely break down. I mean, when you look at how far removed we are from how humans used to live to where we are now, it is amazing that we haven't died out as a species. And I don't, like, again, I don't mean that like doomsday, but my gosh, the human body is super amazing. It can heal itself. It's not meant to be sick. You need to implement these protocols. So you can't sit and listen and say, oh yeah, what she's saying, that makes sense. Yeah. And not implement it and expect to get well. Like, you need to take yourself, be respectful to your body, and heal yourself. Like, no one is going to do it for you. And I'm not going to do it for you. I'll teach you how to do it, but I'm not going to come to your house and knock on your door and be like, you eat this and you do this. No, like, you have to implement, you have to be responsible for your own health. Okay. So nobody's going to come and do this for you. Your doctor doesn't, I mean, maybe you have a really great doctor, but your doctor is not as invested as in your health as you are. You are the most invested in your health of any other human. So you need to take responsibility for your own health. Quit with the excuses. We all have them. We all have voices in our heads. Set your environment up to be successful, whether that's your food environment, your work environment, the people you hang out with, talking with your family members, your friends that you hang out with. Maybe you need a new network of friends, and maybe that's drastic, but maybe it's true. You can get better and you can heal your body. And bringing all of this new information with future guests and future podcasts, future posts. I'm building a new course, which again is crazy to think about. But I want you guys to have this information, and I want you to learn it all so you can fully heal. You can heal your body given the right environment and the right building blocks. I've said that for years. Bringing in this other environmental piece and the piece of, light and even water. I'll be talking more about the water that we drink and hydration and how you truly get hydrated. We'll be talking about that as well, but you can do it. There's at no point, and of course, if you're like on your deathbed, and again, I don't mean to demean, just say that flippantly, because I just saw this with my mom, but of course there comes a point where you can't, if you're, like my mom's in hospice, I'm not going to reverse her cancer at that point, or I'm not, there does come a point, but for the most part, what I'm saying is you can reverse your disease process. You can get healthy. You need to put your body in the right environment, and you need to give it the right building blocks in order to heal. So that's what this podcast is going to all be about from now forward. We're still going to talk a lot about blood sugar and insulin resistance, but I'm also going to be talking more about leptin resistance, about cortisol issues, about melatonin, and how the sunlight, the water that we drink, and all of these things come into play. So I hope you enjoyed this Q&A. If you have a question that you want answered on a future podcast episode, send it to my awesome assistant, Keely, support@fasttoheal.info. I'll see you back next week.